Hello and welcome to the Bank News Media webinar series. My name is Afton Rodriguez with Bank News Media, and it is my pleasure to host today's webinar, The Road to Successful Relationship, Profitability Analyst and Pricing, a panel discussion. I would like to take a moment to thank you all today for attending today's webinar. We will have a question and answer period at the end, so please submit your questions using the question function on your screen when they will arise. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and everyone registered will receive a link to access the recording later today. Today's webinar will go more in depth on how to best leverage relationship profitability analysts and pricing to add value in your intuition. Our speakers today are Ryan Neese, Brian Spellman, and Brian Ridgway. Ryan is Vice President and Financial Planning and Analyst Manager for Lake City Bank in Indiana, and is responsible for overseeing profitability measurements across several business units to drive strategic planning and decision making. Brian Spellman is Director of Financial Planning and Analyst at First Business Financial Services in Wisconsin. Brian chairs the bank's Profitability Steering Committee, providing strategic direction and application of funds transfer pricing and cost allocation rules and drivers across organizational, product, and relationship profitability. Brian Ridgway is a Senior Solution Engineer with Kaufman Hall's Axiom Software Financial Institution practice. In this role, Brian assists clients and prospects in understanding how the Axiom solutions can help analyze and improve their overall financial performance. Now, please join me in welcoming Ryan, Brian, and Brian to the Bank News webinar series.
Thanks, Afton, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. To kick us off, I wanted to start with this opening thought, which is the importance of bringing profitability analysis from a back office process to a full organizational process. And really what we think is that it's incumbent upon CFOs and the overall finance departments within banks to figure out how to optimize the financial performance of the overall organization. And in doing so, really to get everyone across the organization aligned and focused on profitability and adding value on a daily basis. And the second point related to this is thinking of value from your customer's perspective. So not only internally for the bank, but for your customers, they're demanding better and more productive relationships with their banks. And so while researching trends in the industry and doing research specifically around this topic, I found an interesting article that was titled "The Top Reasons Why You Need to Focus Relationship Banking for Your Business." And so this article is actually written from a bank customer perspective, in this case, actually a corporate customer. And they indicated that relationship banking provides the following benefits to the business, right, to your customers. Provides them with better rates, terms, and deal structures, potentially lower and fewer fees, access to your relationship banker's network, provides better service in all their interactions with the bank, as well as gaining valuable insights and potentially even helping with strategic planning for their businesses. So these are all reasons why the customer is interested in better relationship banking with your organization. And for the rest of today's session, we're going to go ahead and share why this is even more important from your bank's perspective. So in order to do that, Ryan, Brian, and I are going to walk through the following topics that are focused on specifically relationship profitability and analysis. The first is better defining the business need around relationship profitability and pricing. Secondly is the importance of making sure that you understand the value that each relationship provides or brings to your organization. Third is that given in today's environment, the fact that you can't price in a vacuum, and we'll talk more about what that means when we get into that section. And then fourth, from an overall profitability perspective, the criticality of consistency. And then finally, we'll go ahead and wrap up with some best practices and key considerations specifically related to relationship profitability and pricing. And so as we work through these agenda items, I'm going to go ahead and start off with some high-level theoretical thoughts and approaches to each of these. And then Brian, Ryan, and I are going to work through some questions so that they can provide you with some valuable insights more from a practitioner's viewpoint, right? As they've worked to improve their processes around relationship profitability and pricing at their own individual institutions. So let's go ahead and get started by defining, again, that business need and value around one, analyzing relationship profitability, and two, an improved pricing process. So at Axiom, we've extensively worked in the market and the industry, performing research, attending and speaking at conferences, meeting with our clients, our prospective clients. And during all of this work, we've discovered that many financial institutions were struggling to effectively and efficiently measure, analyze, and ultimately utilize relationship profitability information at their banks and organizations. So the challenges that we found were primarily focused in these four areas, which we then use to shape the solution that we offer to the market around relationship profitability and pricing. So these challenges were, first, the inability to effectively identify, build, and store complex corporate and consumer relationship definitions. Second was the inability to accurately measure and monitor profitability at the account level, at the customer level, and finally at that full relationship definition level for the organization, both on historical profitability as well as projected profitability. And then third was the inability to accurately price new deals based on the value of the full relationship, as well as the inability to understand the impact of each new deal on the expected profitability, again, of that full relationship. And then finally, the fourth was the inability to perform detailed analysis in order to understand the value that each account, that each customer, that each relationship, and even relationship manager is bringing to the organization. Right, so when we're talking about relationship profitability and pricing, really this is the scope of the discussion today, the scope of the solution that we offer to the market, encompassing, again, all four of these areas. So hopefully that helps define some of the scope for today's session. And with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Ryan and Brian to provide some quick background regarding, first, their institutions and area of focus at their institutions, and then secondly, their business needs around that definition, that scope of relationship profitability and pricing. So Ryan, why don't you go ahead and kick it off for us in those areas?
Sure. Good day, everyone. Lake City Bank, we're really a long-term and consistent organic growth story. We are headquartered in Warsaw, Indiana, and we have 50 branches. We have about $4.9 billion in banking assets, and we also have $1.9 billion in trust assets. And we are a very commercial banking focused. We have 39 credit smart commercial bankers. We believe very strongly in face-to-face customer contacts, and we're also very technology focused. And so if I were to summarize just in a brief statement of what was our business need for relationship profit and pricing, because we are such a focused commercial bank, we decided many years ago to become more relationship focused so we could gain a better understanding of those vital relationships. So it helps us to see the value of those individual relationships that we service each and every day.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And Brian, how about you at First Business?
Yep, thanks, Brian, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So Brian Steelman, First Business Bank. We're out of Madison, Wisconsin. We're also a commercial focused bank. I think a little more so than others. We really have a limited branch network. We have 4 branches, 3 in the state of Wisconsin, 1 outside the state. And because of that, you know, we really, I should mention too, we're $2 billion in assets, both on and off balance sheet. But we're really focused on relationships because of that limited branch network. So it really is important for us to develop and understand the full relationship when we do and do not have it, to build that deposit base to fund our what I'll call above average loan growth. So that's really what the crux of our business need for that profitability and pricing system is.
Perfect, thanks guys. So let's go ahead and transition to our first detailed section for today, and that is the importance of understanding the value of each relationship for the organization. And so to level set here, what I want to do is start with what we mean when we're referring to a relationship. We're not really just referring to an individual customer that has a relationship with the bank, but rather what we're doing is we're talking about a group of quote unquote related customers. So these could be business relationships, they could be personal relationships, they could be familial relationships. So let's start by looking at an example of really what we mean by defining a quote unquote complex relationship. So here's an example where we have Triple J Restaurant Group, and that restaurant group has a series of corporate accounts with the bank, right? And John Smith is the general partner, the primary owner of Triple J Restaurant Group. He's also married and has some personal accounts with the bank as well. And then John also has two partners that he works with at Triple J Restaurant Group, Jim Billings, who also happens to have a architectural design company that has a C&I loan with the bank, and Joan Works, who owns a restaurant supply company in addition to her work with Triple J Restaurant Group. She's married, and between her and her spouse, they also have some business and personal accounts with the bank. And then finally, True Venture Capital Incorporated has invested capital into Triple J Restaurant Group, and True Venture Capital is owned by John Willis, and John Willis actually personally has some wealth management accounts with the institution as well. So as we think about all the interrelationships between all the customers and accounts for Triple J Restaurant Group, what we're really talking about here is a single relationship that is crossing 8 different customers, and at this time, 15 different accounts with the bank. So again, understanding that full sphere of influence that each one of these individual people or customers or entities have from a full relationship perspective is absolutely critical. So as you think about relationships at your bank, it's important to make sure that you understand which relationships are creating value and which ones are not, right? And so Bain & Company has actually done research and studies in the marketplace into the makeup and the impact of corporate relationships on banks. And what they found is that on average, only 20% of corporate relationships are creating economic profit. And in total, the majority of the value is actually being generated by just the top 1% of those relationships. That's over here on the makers section of this graph, right? So if this is the case, as an institution, as an individual officer or relationship manager, you better be able to, one, identify who those relationships are and which customers are part of those relationships. And then secondly, do everything that you can do to make sure that they don't leave your organization. You need to hang on to these top performers. Right, and while it's critical to understand and have plans around the makers here, it's just as important to understand how your full customer base spans and contributes to value of the overall organization. So on average, the typical bank has about 30% of their corporate relationships that are actually detracting value from the organization, and about 50% are the steady eddies, or what we refer to here as the skaters, where depending on the month, they may add some value that may be unprofitable, depending on the number of transactions, the number of fees, those types of items. So as you look at this full spectrum, for instance, looking at the bottom performers here in this bottom 1%, typically those bottom 1% are made up of those low profitability clients, but they're gonna oftentimes have large balances. So if you can come up with a plan to increase the spread or their margin because they have large balances, it could actually have a pretty significant impact to the overall earnings for the organization. So just as important to focus on the top as the middle, and then even the bottom there. So quick example of what this might look like. Here's an example of a dashboard where we're looking at the top performers for the institution, right? The top most profitable relationships. So we've got BMOS Construction, our highest profitability in the current month. They're also our highest profitability relationship over the past 12 months in terms of contribution. And then who's our highest performing relationship in terms of risk-adjusted return on capital. And we'll talk about the risk-adjusted return on capital a little bit more later. but also then who our lowest performing relationships are, to make sure we can come up with plans and ideally improve their profitability, or potentially decide that we don't want to have a relationship with them if they're consistently and continually unprofitable. And then ranking our different relationships. So we can see here our top 10 most profitable relationships, our bottom most profitable or least profitable relationships, and some information related to those. So important to be able to identify them and to rank them. And ultimately though, once you've measured that profitability, once you've ranked your relationships, what do you do with that information? Well, as a best practice, again, Bain found that the top performing institutions across the country are categorizing their relationships into tiers, right? And those tiers are based off of some combination of profitability metrics, whether that be revenue, whether that be risk-adjusted return on capital, whether that be on profitability, as well as then relationship size. But as we've worked out in the marketplace, we've also seen customers use other factors in the definition of those tiers as well, which might be the time that the customers have been with the bank, the number of accounts they have, the types of accounts they have. So again, determining that definition of how you want to tier your different customers. But then once you've sorted those customers into tiers, you want to enable your relationship managers and your teams to be able to use that information to develop relationship management plans for your different relationships based on those tiers. You want to make sure that you're hanging on to your most valuable relationships. You ideally want to improve the profitability of your low profit, high balance relationships. And you also want to use the profitability tier information really to drive all of your interactions and all of your decisions with your customers as they come in and interact with the organization. So at this point, I want to go ahead and open it back up to Brian and Ryan here for some of their perspectives related specifically to this definition and value of the relationships at their institutions. And Brian, since Ryan went first last time, we'll go ahead and have you go first this time. If you could go ahead and answer first on each of these questions, then I'll turn it over to Ryan question by question and get your perspectives here. So first, Brian, can you describe the importance of being able to define those complex relationships at your bank? You talked about being a commercial bank, so not just that individual customer, but really the ability to group those customers into a full relationship.
Yeah, you bet. So that's really what it comes down to it for us, is that commercial focus we have, and where we see the invaluable information to be able to categorize those relationships, right? When you think about it from a commercial perspective, you're going to have multiple LLCs under one umbrella, and then you have the personal assets with those business owners. And so to really truly understand and get a good idea of who the primary decision maker is in a relationship and the related customers and accounts is really where you have to start in any profitability system. So.
Okay, great. And then Ryan, what about from your perspective at Lake City Bank? Oh, Ryan, are you there?
Hey, sorry, I got bumped off the call. So yes, I'm here now.
Okay,
so
great.
For us, the importance of fully defining relationships is it really just gives us a better perspective of our customers, is the main point that I would say here for this one.
Okay, great. And then, Brian, you alluded to this a little bit. The second question, again, related to this is really for your bank, why was it important to understand relationship profitability, right? So thinking about profitability at that relationship level, as well as being able to price at that relationship level, right? Not just the account level, but that full, not the customer level, but that full relationship level.
Yeah, you mentioned, I alluded to it. I was trying not to answer that second question and the first question, because this is where I wanted to get to. But really, we're looking again to understand the breadth of a relationship, so we can say who's the primary decision maker, because we want to know what's at risk, right? A lot of times, historically, we were just pricing to the market, and the competition would come in with different rates, and we would think they're silly rates and be frustrated and not really have a clear picture of what's going on. But with the full relationship view, you're able to understand, one, who's the decision maker, and what all is at risk with that. If you're pricing at the market, and can you go lower than that and feel comfortable that you're still accreting into the value to the company, right? Not eroding value. So that's really what the benefit we've seen so far is not pricing at a transaction level into the market, but really looking at that full relationship and increasing that value and not losing value because of not having that information.
Great, thanks, Brian. And then Ryan, what about your perspective, your team's perspective at Lake City Bank?
Yeah, so I think we came to the conclusion that not all loans are created equal, and we wanted to bring some awareness to a 5% loan, depending on the term and the different attributes of the loan. They're not all the same, and we also really wanted to understand the value of the deposits and how that can maybe help us price the loan more competitively. And chasing once again that full relationship and how we can better service our customers.
Perfect, thanks, Ryan. And then Brian, for you, the next question here is, as we think about the definition of those relationships, which customers belong to which relationship, how you're going to group them together. Can you walk us through who owns that process at your institution? Is that managed centrally within finance or accounting? Is that managed by your credit group, your loan group, or have you pushed that out to your individual officers or relationship managers?
Yeah, this is one of those data questions that can get tricky, right? And so just in terms of who owns and fighting over who owns and whatnot. So what we've chosen to do is really centralize that and centralize it to the point where we're doing it the new mapping in finance, but we're also doing onboarding through the core system. So we're using our core system to initially create those relationships and then maintain those relationships. And we have a process that we work through for some change management there as it works through the system, but really centralizing it, avoiding any fighting over different relationships, and it's worked well for us so far.
Okay, great, thanks. And Ryan, same question for you as far as what that process looks like at Lake City Bank.
Sure. Yeah, I would say we use more of a team approach to the process, and it's just because it gets more people owning the relationships and being a part of it. So the actual work, the mapping of the relationships is centralized with the FP&A team. So that is our responsibility to map them. But we work with our credit team, our credit analysts, and our commercial bankers to help validate the customers in each relationship. So it's not just our job to make sure they're right. We all kind of work together to validate and make sure that we're including the proper people in these relationships as we move forward.
That's a great point there. So it sounds like kind of a little bit of a hybrid approach there. So good stuff. So I think finally, anything maybe that you haven't touched on in the previous three questions there, really kind of focused on the value and use of that information, whether it's by your teams, by your executive team at your bank, and how you're using that information today, the value you're getting from it, or even how you envision increased value as you continue to go forward and evolve in your process. Brian, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you mentioned it earlier, Brian, bringing this from the back office to the front line or into the corporate company wide, and it's really, and then Ryan mentioned it too, really driving home the value of the full balance sheet from a relationship perspective, right? The value of a in-market deposit, and that not all loans are created equal. I mean, that education process and transparency throughout the company as we dive down through this and start to see examples in our institution has been very valuable for us and helping us create more value across our relationships.
Great, thanks. And Ryan, same for you, thinking about the value and use of that information at Lake City?
We made a decision really early on that this process, these results, we're not going to be a red light, green light on whether we make or don't make a loan, because we still wanted people to use their brains and we wanted them to think about the process and use their gut. But we want this to give us a greater awareness, right? We want to make more informed decisions. We want to better understand the impact of our pricing decisions. And where we want to go with this, if I was to cast a little vision here, we hope to bring greater visibility of these vital commercial relationships to our retail banking team. So we want the whole organization then to begin to understand who they're servicing each and every day. And that will open the doors for, more cross-sell opportunities across the bank and that as well. So it's bringing that awareness to make better decisions and to help people understand who these people are and identifying them so we can service them to the best of our ability.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Good stuff there. So let's go ahead and transition to our next topic here. And what we want to talk about here is the fact that, again, in today's environment, you can't price in a vacuum. And by this, I mean, given today's tight margins and challenges that the overall banking industry is facing with respect to loan growth, with respect to deposit growth, and having the liquidity to support, if you are able to grow loans, having the liquidity to support that loan growth, the competitive pressures that are being faced out in the marketplace around pricing, not only on the loan side, but I know, Ryan, you mentioned the deposit side as well. So really making sure that each deal is accreting value for the organization and not diluting that value for the organization. So as we think about how to do this, really as an organization, as a bank, we should step back and ask and analyze our own pricing process, really to determine what is the basis for our current pricing. Are we pricing based on the competition and only using that competition? And do we even know then if we're adding profitable value to the organization if we're pricing on competition? Are we pricing just based on that individual transaction or just that single deal, not knowing what the value of the impact is to that full relationship, right? Which is really that next question there. Are we able to really look at this across the value of the entire relationship? Are we accounting for all of the different levers as we think about profitability, as we think about the revenue side and the cost side in that pricing process? And do we understand, as we talked about before, the definition of that complex relationship, that full sphere of influence that a customer might have as they walk in and are working with you to go ahead and get a new loan or a combination of loan and deposit accounts, that type of thing. So really, again, we want to make sure that we're including the relationship value in that pricing process and that we understand that, and that we're also then focused on not only retaining, but growing our profitability for the organization, right? We want to focus on profitable growth, not just growth. Again, as one of the lessons that we learned out of the financial crisis about 10 years ago. So how do we do this? Well, we do this by moving from a product-based pricing approach, which I think most organizations have done, right? Where we're not just basing pricing based on the product that the customer is looking for, to a risk-based pricing approach where we're going to be able to adjust the product-based pricing based on the individual characteristics of that customer, the risks of that customer, right? The different types of collateral that they might have, so on and so forth. And ultimately, getting to a relationship-based approach where we're not only looking at the risk and the value of that individual deal or that individual customer, but really allowing for or not allowing for adjustments to pricing and the deal structure based on the projected value and profitability on that full relationship with that new deal, right? So really getting to that full relationship-based analysis. And ultimately, the goal here is really trying to get to a win-win situation for both the organization and for the customer. So for the organization, for the bank, we want to ensure that we're creating value by improved earnings, that we're able to retain and improve the profitability of our relationships, that we're ensuring growth, as I mentioned before, but not just growth, but growth at a profitable level, and ultimately also having an effective as well as efficient process for your different officers and your relationship managers. While at the same time, we want to make sure that we're creating value for the customers themselves, right? That they have an efficient process that's going to enable them to make better and faster decisions, that they have multiple options presented to them in deal structures that are going to best meet their needs, and then ultimately ensuring that they develop a strong relationship with the bank, really focused on long-term value for their organization. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it back over to Ryan and Brian here with some additional questions, specifically around that pricing process. So Ryan, why don't you go ahead and lead us off this time as you think about specifically that pricing component of the overall RPPS equation. Remember, we talked about those 4 different components, but specifically around pricing at Lake City Bank, how important was that pricing component to you and your organization as you look at the overall RPPS solution and process?
Yeah, so for us, that was super important. And the reason why is that the pricing component, helps you see where you're going. So you can better quantify the future impact of the decisions that you're making today. We've also had a lot of success with new opportunities and helping you project the potential profit so you can be more competitive with someone who you don't even have a relationship with today. And so it's really that future impact and understanding what you're doing today and the results that are going to come about that from the future.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And I know it sounds like we're getting some feedback on the line. Hopefully, we're working to address that. But why don't we go ahead and continue on, just because I know we've got to get through and we're limited on our time today. So, Brian, as you think about or First Business Bank pricing component of that RPPS equation, how important was specifically that pricing component?
Yeah, that's the number one priority for us. Like I said, we already had a pretty good handle on the relationship mapping side outside of the system in our core. Profitability, historical profitability, we were okay on, but the pricing piece is the missing gap right now in our frontline model. So it is absolutely crucial and key to our long-term success.
Okay, great. And then Ryan, back to you as it relates to pricing. As an organization, what were you doing previously for pricing purposes before you implemented the new solution and the new process for that account pricing piece?
Sure. So, when I think back, we've been running pricing simulations here at Lake City Bank for over 10 years now. And so we've been doing this for a little while. But we recently implemented the Axiom RPPS solution, and we just really feel that's going to take this experience to a whole new level because it has a better user experience. So it's going to kind of be a fresh face, as I call it, for profitability. The calculations are more robust than what we were doing in the past when it comes to the pricing piece. And add to that, better transparency of how the results are calculated. So we really feel like that's going to add a lot of value to increase the buy-in of all the results because of the transparency that we're going to get out of the new program.
All right, great. Thanks, Ryan. And then Brian, from your perspective, as far as what you were doing previously?
Yeah, we had a really, which I'm sure some of us on the call had the same thing, a really fancy Excel spreadsheet that took it at a transaction level. So it's something we built years ago and had limited costs, if any, built in. We did do a risk-adjusted capital allocation approach to it, but it was not very detailed. And so, truly just a very simple directional indicator of value at a transaction level, and I think a very slippery slope for us over the years in trying to create value. So really happy with the direction we're going now with RPPS.
Okay, very good. And again, this next one may have covered a little bit with the previous one, but any additional thoughts, Ryan, from you as far as think about why you felt like you needed to change that process from what you were previously doing and the value that you're seeing at the institution?
Anytime you can improve your process and create more accurate results and also improve transparency, and so ultimately hopefully get more actionable results, I mean that's a no-brainer to me. That's a game changer there.
And then Brian, same for you from First Business perspective as far as why the change and then some of the value that you're seeing from that change.
Yeah, so besides the fact that we didn't have much of anything before, I think two things we're looking that were key pieces in our decision-making process that we're looking to get out of this are, Ryan mentioned the transparency. So the ability to actually just see the output real time as you're doing a pricing decision, I think goes a long way in getting that buy-in And that's kind of then step two, then that buy-in. So the front line is actually using this tool. I think a lot of times in our shops, and what we have seen historically, is that the credit analysts are punching in these numbers after the fact, right? The deal's already going to committee, and there wasn't any critical thinking involved in the process along the way in terms of what the relationship profitability was and what these pricing decisions do to that relationship, right? So really hoping to make this a more proactive process at the front line, and have better decisions come out of it. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. And then Ryan, lastly for you specifically around the pricing process, any challenges or key considerations as you think about rolling this piece out, either if you've done it or as you're getting ready to roll this out across your organization, either that you're thinking about specifically for your institution, or potentially that you think the audience should think about and be aware of it and in that rollout process of the pricing component?
Yeah, the thing that comes top of mind is training, and I think that's going to be a big part of the process, and that's that end user training, right, to ensure that we get those consistent results, because I can set up the best system with the most accurate theories and have it all set up in the background right, but if the person running that pricing simulation doesn't run it right, they're going to greatly affect the results, and you're going to send the wrong message out to the organization. So end user training will definitely be, and is definitely a challenge that we'll definitely put our efforts into.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And then Brian, for you at First Business, as you're thinking about that rollout of the pricing piece, any challenges or key considerations?
Yeah, for us, it's making sure that initial, I'll say, user interface is very seamless. So just kind of launching, we have so many applications that we have to log into, and so it's very simple for us. It's getting a single sign-on process, which is very easy to do. But then from there, just keeping it simple as possible in the calculation process. So again, we retain that credibility and transparency throughout to get that buy-in and get that usability from the front line. Otherwise, it's going to be another system that you put on the shelf and sits there and collects dust. So.
Okay, great. Again, good stuff, guys. Let's go ahead and move on to our next topic here. And actually, Brian, with your answer, probably a bit of a good segue into this topic. And we've labeled this the criticality of consistency. So really talking about why consistency is so important as we think about relationship profitability and pricing, and in order to get that buy-in across the organization, right? So really, as I thought about this, I found this phrase and found that I think this best summed it up, and that is that consistency equals trust, right? As you want people across the organization to use this information, not only on a daily basis, but on an intraday basis, right? Each time they're interacting with your customers and pricing new deals, as you're looking to create that culture of profitability across the organization, they need to know that they can trust the information, right? And in order for them to trust the information, you need to make sure that you have a consistent approach in generating the information. So really, as we break that down, what do we mean by this? Well, first is that first bullet point there. We want to make sure that we have a consistent approach to measuring profitability across all dimensions, whether it be, the department level, line of business level, channel profitability, product profitability, officer relationship, as we're talking about here, even down to the customer and account level, making sure that we have a consistent approach to measure profitability across all of those different segments. And then secondly, as you're using the profitability as part of that pricing process, right, for that projected profitability, you want to make sure that we have a consistent rules and approaches for measuring historical profitability and for measuring that projected profitability as part of pricing, right? And then finally, if we're driving to create this culture of profitability focused on value across the organization, you want your product owners, you want your line of business managers, you want your department managers to focus on profitability even in their budgeting and planning process. So really making sure that as we do our budgeting and planning, that we have that same approach, and that profitability is one of those targets that they're going to be evaluated on an actual versus budget basis as well. So let's talk about a few of these in a little bit more detail. So here's a quick example of what we mean by consistency and approach across different segments or dimensions. On the left is a P&L statement, again, summary level for an individual relationship, showing that we've accounted for and calculated profitability using all of the components of profitability, right? We have our interest income and expense. We have our FTP credit and charge getting us to our net interest income. We have our provision for loan loss. We have our non-interest income or our fees. We have our non-interest expense, our costs that are being calculated, as well as the ability to allocate capital in order to get down to a return on equity or risk-adjusted return on capital. And what we can see on the right is now we're looking at a product profitability statement where we have the same structure and approach for product line profitability, where we can see the same components of profitability are being accounted for, and we have the same approaches and calculations that are supporting product profitability, as well as, in this case, relationship profitability. So again, that's what we're referring to with consistency across different segments or dimensions of the organization. Well, as I mentioned earlier, you also need to ensure consistency between your current and historical measurement calculations, as well as then your projected profitability approaches and calculations. So as you're performing what-if pricing on a profitability basis, you and your teams need to make sure that you feel confident that once those deals are actually brought onto the books, so if we've priced a new deal and projected the profitability, if we actually book that deal, that the actual profitability that will be calculated for that deal once it's brought onto the books is the same that it would be in the projected profitability, because we're using the same approach and same calculations. So again, really consistency is the key, not only to getting the understanding of profitability, but getting that buy-in and getting people across the organization to think the same way every day in all of their decisions that they're making, right? Whether it be from an actual to projected profitability basis, like we just talked about, whether it be in setting goals and targets, like we talked about, that budgeting, planning versus profitability process, developing those relationship tiers and the relationship and account plans, as I mentioned earlier, as well as using that information for marketing and cross-selling initiatives. Again, making sure that we have that consistency across all of those different processes. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it back over to Brian and Ryan as it relates to then this consistency and some of the areas that I just discussed around that consistency for profitability. So starting off with a high-level question, Brian, we'll start with you at First Business. What segments of your institution or dimensions of your institution are you all calculating profitability for? Department profitability, product profitability, customer relationships, so on and so forth. Can you just describe what you're doing at First Business?
Yeah, you bet. So we have been doing department, or what I'll call organizational profitability for years now, probably 10 plus years, and very consistent in the approach we're using there. And we have, over the past 5 or so years, gone down to the product level, but starting at the account level and kind of rolling back up to the product level. And that's kind of where we got to see the benefit in looking at a new system, is that consistency in approach. So previously, we'd have FTP methodology in one system. We'd have to kind of try to replicate that same methodology in the next system, trying to, some were more simple than others. So, but right now we're able to do org, product, relationship, account level if we want to, instrument level, all using a consistent approach.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. And then Ryan, for you at Lake City Bank, again, what segments or dimensions of profitability across your institution are you all calculating and analyzing?
Today, we are really focusing primarily on the value of our commercial relationship. So that's where most of the attention is focused. But we are in the process of redefining our org prof solution. So we've had this, these allocation rules and stuff running in the background, but we found that what we established a long time ago isn't really how we run the business today. So we're redefining that and kind of rolling up these same calculations and profitability results from the individual accounts and rolling them up in a different methodology so we can see the business the way we really run it today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan. And so as we think about back to that example that I talked about, and really the ability to account for all of the levers or components of profitability, from funds transfer pricing and interest income and expense, and the provision for loan loss, the costing piece, right, and the ability to allocate costs all the way down to that individual level, the capital allocation piece. Brian, how important was it in your process at First Business to be able to account for all of those components of profitability, and what did that decision process look like for your organization as you tried to determine the approach for each of those levers, right? Because there's a lot of different levers there for profitability. Kind of walk through what that process looked like in making those decisions of how to set up those rules, if you will.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that, you know, I think data is the hardest part about all this, and then I think these decisions here on profitability and what levers you're pulling is probably the second hardest, and one that requires a lot of consensus across the organization. This is where we've really leveraged the use of a profitability steering committee, where we meet, you know, always at least once a year during the budget process, but maybe more than once, depending on what's going on, but really trying to get everyone's understanding of various business lines and levels of the organization on how they define value and what ultimately drives profitability. And so in doing it at that level, these key decision makers are able to then take that and carry that on throughout the organization. Because at the end of the day, all of this is at this point kind of an art, right? The art and relationship profitability, and we in finance have a lot of good insight into that, but we don't want to own that necessarily in those decisions. So it's good to have that partnership at the business line level, and so that's the approach we've taken so far, and it's worked very well for us.
That's great, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more in a bit. So good information there. And then Ryan, for y'all at Lake City Bank, as far as, you know, those different levers of profitability and the importance to be able to account for all of them, and kind of what your decision process looked like in deciding how to set up the rules and calculations for those.
Yeah, so when I think of those 5 levers, you know, depending on how far your institution is along the profitability journey, like this is where all the work kicks in, right? You've got to develop all these methodologies and learn what FTP is. And the accuracy of your data, as Brian said, is so important. You know, have you captured all that fee income? You know, how does your institution want to define a relationship? You know, these are all those conversations that you have to have along with different people around the bank, especially your stakeholders. So I guess for us, we had a lot of support from the executive team, and we did a lot of those at the executive level and talking about where we want to go. You know, and why is that important? Because when you hone in on that single relationship, if you're missing data points or you have improper allocations, they just rise to the top and they become very apparent right away. So we did a lot of digging and testing of the results before we went live in production. That way we could hopefully bring out some of those problem areas before the end users began to see them. Because I think sometimes those levers, those decisions that you make, even if you have a group around the table making that decision, people don't always understand how those levers are going to affect that single relationship that now you're portraying is worth this amount of value. So some of that stuff can be difficult to comprehend. Trial and error is definitely part of it too, because you want to make sure that the big picture of what you're doing in this tool is consistent with what's going on at your bank at the high level as well.
All right, great stuff, Ryan. And then I think really for the next two, I'll combine these into a kind of single question and answer here, which is really, as we think about relationship profitability pricing, we talked about consistency and the importance of consistency. But as we think about that compared to other key factors of making sure that you're accurate, that it's a simple to use solution. I know, Brian, you mentioned simplicity for the end users before, the ability to defend the results. As you think about that across the organization, as well as then that consistency between historical and projected, kind of where does consistency fall compared to those other key factors, or how much you rank those, or were they all important? So just some thoughts around those. Brian, if you want to go first there.
Yeah, so I'll say they're all very important, but specifically I'll say who you partner with and going down this and deploying a solution is very helpful in the simplicity and defensibility side of things, how transparent the system is, and how easy it is to work with. And so that's something that Axiom Solutions is very helpful with. And then so leaving consistency and accuracy, I'll say very important. But I'll choose consistency over accuracy because I want to be. I always say in forecasting in particular, I'm wrong no matter what, right? So I want to be in a position where I'm directionally accurate and a consistent approach of that directional accuracy. And I think at the end of the day, I'll be successful doing it that way. But the lack of consistency can really derail this process very early on if you're not careful.
All right, very good. And then Ryan, from your perspective, same questions.
Yeah, so I agree. They're all really, really important. But the one I guess that stands out for me is simplicity is the key. And when I say simplicity, theory and calculations aren't always simple. They're not going to be simple. So that's not what I'm referring to. But you got to figure out a simple way to explain them. They don't have to understand all the details, but you've got to figure out a way to let your end user really understand what's happening in a simplistic model so that they can truly understand and not just throw it all off as hogwash at the end.
All right, perfect, guys. Thanks. And so let's go ahead and get into the final section for today's session, which is really going to be focused around some best practices as well as then key considerations. So as Axiom has worked in the industry, specifically in this area, we've gathered a lot of information. We've worked with a lot of clients, prospective clients, and we think we've developed a number of best practices then in this area. And so I've tried to boil that down to three main items here to think about from a relationship profitability and pricing perspective. And the first is to start with the end in mind. And by this, what I mean is that you really want to think about how you want to use relationship profitability and that pricing process at your institution, right? You need to know before you start the process what decisions you want to make with the results before you start thinking about the data and the tools and the processes, right? And so we've listed here a number of the different types of decisions, whether it be the pricing decisions as we talked about, whether it be developing relationship plans, product strategy, a number of different items that you can see here, really again focused on what types of decisions that you want to make, right? And then secondly, what you need, once you have that end in mind in place and you know what decisions you want to make, you then need to make sure you understand what data that you need and where you're going to source that data from, right? And then also decide, as we talked about just in the previous section, upon those profitability approaches and calculations that are going to be used, whether that's through a steering committee, whether that's through just the finance and accounting team, as Brian said, or as Ryan said at Lake City, a little bit of the trial and error where we developed the approach and then did some analysis on it before we rolled it out, just to make sure we kind of work through some of those items, right? Because you want to make sure that you're able to defend the decisions that you're going to make as you roll this out. And then the third piece is really making sure that you consider the political and cultural impacts of what you want to do and try and head them off at the pass. And it sounds like a little bit, Ryan, what you did at Lake City Bank, as well as Brian with your profitability steering committee. What we find is that profitability and maybe specifically FTP within that profitability equation can be very controversial at an institution. It can be a big cultural and political shift for an institution. So making sure you think about those items ahead of time, making sure that you're putting in plans for training and education and that simplicity and defensibility, right? And thinking through all of those before just implementing a new system, pushing it out and just say, everybody use it, right? So again, our recommendation around all of this is actually aligned with what Brian talked about, and that is setting up a profitability steering committee that can help guide through all three of these best practices, as well as a number of other items. Again, that committee can help make decisions. They can help get work done, right? If you need some work done, they can actually help get that work done. They can provide different perspectives, not just from a finance and accounting side. And really, I think ultimately, they can help get buy-in across the bank as you roll out the results and the information and the processes, because they've been involved since the beginning, and they can help support you through that process. So just some quick thoughts on best practices and key considerations from, I'll say, my perspective or Axiom's perspective. But let me go ahead and turn it back over to Ryan and Brian here. And Ryan, maybe starting with you at Lake City, as you think about key considerations that you think people in the audience attending the webinar today should consider as they look to implement and leverage relationship profitability and pricing at their institutions.
Sure. So I'm going to take this question a little different direction than what maybe you're anticipating, but I would say, be curious. And I'm going to talk about the person doing this and doing these analysis. Just like we're building relationships of our customers, that person needs to get out of their cubicle and build the relationships with their customers, the people, right, at your institution that you're providing those results for. And the reason I say that's so vital, because I think the more they trust and believe in the people handling the process, the more they'll trust and believe in the profitability results themselves. So, we decided a few years ago that we wanted FP&A to be that strategic advisor for the organization. And, in order to be that advisor, you've got to really understand the process and know what you're talking about. So we're always learning, we're always growing, but we're building those relationships with our key stakeholders so that they trust the process and the decisions that we're making in the solution.
Great, thanks Ryan. And then Brian, First Business, same question for you around the key considerations.
Yeah, I think where I would be a little more granular in my comments here, I guess, and speaking to data. And so I liked Brian, your first bullet there on the prior page was keeping the end in mind. And so keeping the end in mind in terms of what data you will need and what form that data will need to be in and what systems it's coming from and how can you leverage existing systems to accomplish what you're looking to accomplish. Because that's really the crux of the system is how good your data is. And so I know from our experience, we've been at the point where we have been doing certain things for a long time with certain data files, and you get to a point in this new implementation and you realize that you're missing a piece of data that you wish you had or that you need. And so that's where I think it's critical and really, really key to hammer on that point again, that keep the end in mind and really start and work backwards there to make sure that you're truly getting the full benefit out of the system.
Okay, great. And then one last final piece here, just kind of one final word of wisdom, advice for the audience. I know you talked about the key considerations here. One final kind of thought from either of you, Ryan, for the audience today.
I would say that, relationship profitability is a journey and it's ever evolving. We call it, we are incessant tinkerers around here. So incessant tinkering, and we're always looking for ways to get better. We started our system with just loans and deposits in the piece. Then, after we got that under our belt, we layered in our wealth advisory accounts and our fee-based brokerage accounts. And we've just, we started with building blocks and we've just been evolving it ever since.
All right, great. Thanks, Ryan. And then Brian, from you, final thought.
Yeah, and I would piggyback off those comments from Ryan too, and that this is an art, like I said before. And so to be as transparent and clear and candid as possible with your end users, the limitations of a system and where you are in the relationship journey, as Ryan put it, and that the obstacles and the opportunities that lay ahead. And the second thing too would be just resource management, right? So once the decision makers on the front line get their hands on this kind of information, they see the power and they really demand a lot of your time. And just be careful there to not overpromise, because there is a ton of power that you get in the organization with this, and so it's key to kind of be careful there to not overcommit with solutions like this too. So.
All right, awesome, and great stuff, guys. Again, thank you to both Ryan, to you, and to Brian for providing those insights. Again, I think always valuable to get the insights from what I'll call a practitioner's perspective, somebody who's gone through the process, has faced the bullets, if you will, and made the decisions. And so really appreciate your guys' insights today. So With that, I did want to leave you with one final thought for today's webinar, and I've talked about this before. Ultimately, your goal here is to try and create a culture that's focused on adding value, a culture focused on profitability across the organization. And to do that by bringing that profitability information from the back office to the front lines, as it indicates here on the slide. So really what you want is that information at the fingertips of the people so they have access to it, that they can drive day-to-day decisions as they're interacting with your customers and ultimately looking to improve value for the overall organization. So with that, I know we're right at the end of time, and we did have a few questions that came in. I think since we're at the end of time though, so those that did ask questions, we'll make sure that we get back to you individually in order to answer your questions. So we did receive those. I'll go ahead and share those with Ryan and Brian, and we'll make sure that we get back to you with those answers and provide that information back to you. So unfortunately, again, don't have time for Q&A here. With that, I did want to thank you all once again. Thank Ryan and Brian for your insights, and let me turn it back over to Afton.
Thank you, Ryan, Brian, and Brian for your time today. Also, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you all enjoyed this. Just a little tidbit: to sign up for any webinars hosted by Bank Media or to view our past webinars, please visit banknews.com/webinars. And as Brian stated, we will get back to anybody that asks questions. They will personally reach out to you when they have a moment. Thank you again for attending today's webinar.